Being born a slave in the Roman Empire meant entering the world without rights, without freedom, and without control over your own destiny. Unlike many forms of slavery later in history, Roman slavery was not based on race, but that didn't make it any less brutal. Here's what it actually meant and why it was so terrible. 1. Being property from birth. What it really meant. When we say a child born to a slave was property, it wasn't just a legal label. It shaped every second of their existence. You weren't seen as a person, you were an asset. In Roman law, slaves were classified as res, a thing, like tools, animals, or furniture. This meant you weren't protected by the same laws as free Romans. Your life was valued only in terms of how much labor or profit you could produce. Your feelings, dreams, and suffering were irrelevant in the eyes of the law. A baby born to a slave mother was often listed in the household inventory like livestock. Your master had absolute control over you. Because you were considered property, your owner had the right to sell you at any age, even as an infant, punish you without consequence, breed you, forcing slaves to have children to increase the master's property, work you to exhaustion, use you for any purpose, including dangerous labor or sexual exploitation, kill you in certain periods of Roman history. Your entire existence depended on the temperament of the person who owned you. Your birth wasn't a celebration, it was an investment. When a slave woman gave birth, masters saw it as free new labor without the cost of buying slaves, a way to increase the household workforce, a future tool or body to be used as needed. Some estates even encouraged slave breeding, treating women like factories for more property. You had no say in your future. Because you were born a slave, everything about your life was already predetermined. Your role in life, where you lived, who you served, what skills you learned, if any, who you could and couldn't be with, whether you might ever be freed. There was no escape route, no dream to pursue, no freedom to choose. Your name, identity, and personality were controlled. Many Roman slaves were given names that reflected their status. Greek names to imply cultured servants. Names like Felix, lucky, or service, slave. Names given as jokes or insults. Your identity was shaped by owners, not by family or culture. Your body was not your own. Being property meant you could be branded or tattooed, you could be forced to wear metal collars, you could be beaten for disobedience, you could be used sexually by your master or sold into brothels. You could be forced into gladiator training or mining, both often fatal. Your body existed for others, not for you. Your relationships could be destroyed instantly. Families of slaves existed purely at the master's mercy. A mother could be sold the day after giving birth. A child could be sold at age 5 or 10. Partners could be separated without warning. Siblings could be assigned to different owners. Emotional bonds had no legal protection. You couldn't own anything. Since slaves were property, they could not legally possess money, land, tools, clothing. Even if a master allowed you to save money, peculium, he could take it back any time.
2. No family security. The cruel reality for slave children. If you were born a slave in Rome, one of the worst things you faced was the constant instability of your family life. Nothing was yours, not even the people you loved. Your family existed only if your master allowed it. Roman slaves could form emotional bonds and relationships, but legally, slave marriages didn't exist. Slave families had no recognition. Parents had no rights over their children. A master could break up a family simply because he felt like it, or because it was profitable. Children could be sold at any age, even as toddlers. Rome treated slave children like livestock. They could be sold at birth, during childhood, right before adulthood when their value increased. This meant you grew up knowing that any day could be your last day with your mother or father. Imagine being a child and living with the constant fear that a stranger might come and take you away. You might never see your parents again. You might end up in a distant province alone. This wasn't a rare event. It was normal. Slave mothers lived in constant terror. A slave mother had no legal right to keep her own child. Masters could sell the baby for profit, give the child away as a gift, rent the child out as labor, trade the child for wine, animals, or equipment. Some mothers hid newborns or begged owners not to sell them, but they had no real power. You grew up without the comfort of stability. Even if your parents weren't sold, they could be assigned to different jobs, sent to work in another city, lent to other households, punished or killed. You might technically live in the same household, but barely see them.
Slave children were raised collectively. Many wealthy estates treated slave children like a group. They were fed together, trained together, disciplined together. Personal emotional development wasn't important, productivity was. Often, older slaves acted as caretakers, not parents. This created a cold, detached upbringing where affection was scarce. Your siblings weren't guaranteed to stay with you, even if you had brothers or sisters. They might be sent to different tasks. One could be trained for domestic service, another for manual labor, another sold at a young age. Keeping family members together wasn't a concern for owners. Punishments could tear families apart. If one member of the family tried to escape or disobey, the entire family might be separated. Children could be sold as punishment. Parents might be tortured or executed. Slave families lived under a constant emotional sword. Love became a liability. The more you loved someone, the more vulnerable you became, because you knew they could vanish from your life. You could be sold away. You were powerless to protect each other. Emotional attachment itself was dangerous. Why this was so devastating? Being born into slavery didn't just take away freedom. It robbed you of the human foundation that gives life meaning. Safety, love, belonging, stability, identity, without family security. Without family security, slave children grew up in a world where nothing was permanent, where love could be severed at any moment, and where every goodbye might be the last. Drei, no legal protection, you were outside the law. For a Roman slave, the most terrifying reality was this: the law did not see you as a human being with rights. It saw you as an object. Because of this, every aspect of justice, safety, and dignity that protected free people simply did not apply to you. Let's break down what that meant in everyday life. You couldn't appeal to the law ever. If a master beat you nearly to death, starved you, sexually abused you, mutilated you, forced you into deadly labor, you couldn't go to a court because legally nothing wrong had happened. A slave wasn't a victim. A slave was property being used. A slave's pain didn't count as harm. Roman law made a chilling distinction. If someone damaged another person's property, like breaking a tool, they owed compensation. If someone harmed a slave, they owed money to the master, not to the slave. Your suffering didn't matter. Your body was just an asset. Physical punishment was unlimited. Because the law didn't protect slaves, any punishment was allowed. Whipping, beating, burning, shackling, cutting hair as humiliation, branding the forehead, sexual assault, killing in several periods. Only during certain emperors, like Hadrian, were there mild restrictions, but even then, slaves still had no rights. You couldn't marry or have a legal family. Slaves could love, but they couldn't marry. Slave marriages, contubernium, were informal and meaningless in court. This meant your partner could be sold away.
Your child could be taken from you. The law saw your family as breeding stock, not as humans. There was no legal protection against family destruction. You couldn't testify against free people. This was a huge sign of how little the law valued slaves. A slave's testimony wasn't accepted in court unless they were tortured first. Romans believed slaves only told the truth under extreme pain. So if you were a witness to a crime, you might be burned, stretched on the rack, beaten, whipped, mutilated, just for your words to count. You could be executed for another slave's crime. One of the most horrific laws was the collective punishment rule. If a slave killed their master, all of the master's slaves could be executed, even if they were innocent. This meant entire slave households wiped out, children, elderly slaves, and innocent workers slaughtered. No chance to argue or defend yourself. Romans believed this kept slaves too terrified to rebel. You couldn't own anything. A slave had no legal right to property. No money, no land, no personal objects, no legal inheritance. Even if a master allowed a slave to keep savings, peculium, legally it still belonged to the master. A lifetime of work could be erased in an instant if the master changed his mind. Your body belonged to someone else. Because slaves had no legal protection, masters could use your body however they wanted. This included forced labor, forced breeding, sexual exploitation, dangerous work like mining, gladiator combat, medical experimentation or training. Your body had no legal personhood, only value. Why this was so terrifying? Not having legal protection didn't just mean poor treatment. It meant you existed in a vacuum where nothing protected you and everything controlled you. It created a world where justice was impossible, abuse was normal, family had no legal meaning, survival depended entirely on someone else's mercy. No one defended you, ever. You weren't just unprotected, you were unprotected by design because the system required slaves to be powerless. 4. Your life path was decided for you, from birth to death. One of the most crushing realities of being born a slave in ancient Rome wasn't just the lack of freedom in the present. It was the absolute certainty that you would never control your future. From the moment you took your first breath, your entire life was mapped out by someone else. Let's break down how total that control was. Your fate was chosen before you were old enough to speak. Slave children, verni, were often evaluated by masters the same way one might evaluate livestock. Strong, farm labor or construction. Small and quick, domestic service. Beautiful, personal attendant or sexual exploitation. Intelligent, secretary or tutor in training. Male and physically promising, gladiator schooling. Weak or sickly, sent to work in cheap, brutal jobs or abandoned. You had no say in this. Your talents didn't belong to you, they belonged to your owner. Your skills were only developed if they benefited the master. Slave children might be given training, but not for their own future, only for the master's profit. Examples: if you showed intelligence, you might be trained in reading, numbers, or medicine, not for your career, but to serve your owner better. If you were strong, physical labor was your destiny, no matter your personal desires. If you were attractive, you could be forced into roles involving intimacy, display, or exploitation. You couldn't choose your career, dreams, or personal goals. Your value was defined by what others wanted from you. The better slave jobs still weren't yours to choose. Some slaves ended up in positions that were less physically brutal. Household servants, scribes, tutors, craftsmen, merchants, managing a shop for the master. But even these depended entirely on luck, on being noticed, on being born with certain traits, or on a master's whim. And even if you held one of these roles, you could be reassigned, you could be sold, you could be punished, you could be forced into worse labor without explanation. Nothing was permanent. Worst paths were like living death sentences.
Some tasks were so deadly that being assigned to them was equivalent to receiving a slow execution. Mines. Slaves in mines lived in darkness, worked until collapse, rarely survived more than a few years, were chained so they couldn't escape. Romans openly called mine slaves damnati ad metallo, condemned to the mines. Galleys, rowers and warships. Shackled to benches, starved and whipped, rowed until muscles tore, thrown overboard when sick or useless. Gladiator schools. Fed well but trained brutally, forced into combat. Most died within a few fights. Bodies were owned even after death. Being assigned to one of these roles wasn't based on choice. It was based on whatever maximized your master's profit. There was no upward mobility. Free Romans could climb socially or economically. Slaves could not. A slave had no choice in occupation, right to education, right to save money unless permitted, path to political or social power. Even if you did all your work perfectly, you were still a slave. And the system was designed so that obedience didn't guarantee improvement and rebellion guaranteed punishment. Even freedom wasn't something you controlled. Some slaves were freed eventually, but you couldn't claim freedom. You couldn't demand manumission. You couldn't negotiate your way out. You couldn't legally buy freedom unless the master allowed you to. Freedom was a gift, never a right, and most slaves never received it. Those born slaves had the lowest chance of all to be freed. Your entire existence was decided by someone else's whims. Roman masters had near total power, which meant your life path could change instantly based on the master's mood, the master's financial problems, inheritance disputes, market changes, punishments, the death of a master, a sale to a crueler owner. A slave's life was a constant reminder that your fate was never your own. Why this was emotionally devastating. Living with a predetermined fate meant no dreams, no ambitions, no goals of your own, no future to shape, no identity outside your labor, no hope for a different life. You weren't allowed to imagine who you could be. You had to accept who your owner decided you were. 5. Violence was normal. Punishments could include whipping, branding, shackling, being forced to wear collars, execution for attempting escape. In some eras, if a master was murdered, all his household slaves could be executed, even if innocent. 6. Constant fear and instability. Slaves lived with the threat of punishment, the possibility of being sold away, unpredictable demands, hard labor, and long hours. Even favorite slaves could lose everything instantly. A few small things, though they never outweighed the suffering. Household slaves could sometimes earn trust and better treatment. Some slaves could accumulate a little money and eventually buy freedom. Freedmen could sometimes become wealthy in business. But these were exceptions, not the norm. In short, being born a slave in the Roman Empire was terrible because you had no rights, you had no freedom, you had no security. You could be abused, sold, or killed at any time. Your life belonged to someone else from the moment you took your first breath. It was not just a bad start to life. It was a lifetime of uncertainty, danger, exploitation, and dehumanization.